So, as we're about to embark on another epic venture, let me just close the chopper door here. By the way, we're sitting in an HX50, so a truly high-end production, I will subtly let you know, with a top-notch pilot to boot.
You can say that again.
And as our chopper is gearing up, a few points before we take off, starting with the fact that the title of this video includes religion. However, as a lifelong agnostic, I don't have a metaphysical dog in this race, not even a puppy. What I do have is a lot of respect for our religious fellow humans. I'm just not one of them. And secondly, as you may know from recent events, there is a religious undercurrent to these recent events that comes dangerously close to the topic of this video. And while we're certainly not going to touch on the specifics of those events, at least not today, when it comes to the general scenario of undercurrents that are not immediately visible, let's put a pin in that. Thirdly, and most importantly, thank you so much for being here with me today. Now, upon takeoff, as the history buffs on this flight might have already noticed, what we're looking at here is the famous Temple of Solomon, also known as the First Temple, built by, well, King Solomon of the United Kingdom of Israel in the 10th century BCE. That's an impressive 3 millennia ago. And just to be sure, this building down there is at least in part a reimagination, albeit a golden reimagination, because there are no authoritative depictions of the entire Temple of Solomon. But by all means, that temple became even more important about 3 centuries after it had been built, when all other temples and sacrificial centers were gradually shut down, making the Temple of Solomon not just a temple, but the temple. Now, one reason for this might have been the goal to present the temple as an extension of the, meaning the only, Garden of Eden, which, like the temple, is said to have been located in an elevated position, apart from other parallels. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism here. The veils you see here, both at the front entrance and the entrance to the heart of the temple, the so-called Holy of Holies, these veils represent the firmament that separates the secular and temporal from the heavenly and eternal. And inside the Holy of Holies, there was arguably the biggest claim to uniqueness for the first temple, which was the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that contained, among other things, the original tablets with the 10 Commandments, carved by Moses. Talk about a unique place. And speaking of places, here is the elevated position I was talking about, the so-called Temple Mount, a stone platform on a hill that overlooks the old city of Jerusalem to this day. And the highest point off that hill, also to this day, is a natural bedrock outcrop called the foundation stone that you see here, and still down there, which is the actual reason the Temple of Solomon was built on that spot. Because foundation in foundation stone does not refer to the temple, but to the world. That's right, according to Jewish faith and at least parts of Islam and Christianity, God created the world from this very spot. Also, all Abrahamitic religions agree that their founding father was about to sacrifice his own son right there when God stopped him. So yeah, real estate is about location, no doubt about that. And that location literally remains in place, even when the structure built upon it is long gone. But you probably already had an inkling in that regard, being that we're looking at the first temple here. And speaking of inklings, there might actually have been a couple of "I'm having a bad feeling about this" moments on the ground when around the turn of the 6th century BCE, the Babylonians started a series of raids and plunderings, especially since there already had been multiple prophecies about the destruction of the temple. And so, somewhat predictably, in 586 BCE, Solomon's temple, the centuries-old heart of Jewish faith, was burned to the ground and stripped of all its treasure. That may even include the Ark of the Covenant, because, except for the people watching Indiana Jones movies, to this day we have no idea what happened to it. However, the Hebrew people at the time had actually more pressing issues at hand, because they were collectively sent into Babylonian exile. And you can read all about that in this masterpiece. Or actually hear all about that in this masterpiece. Now, the reason this gentleman, a Persian king of all people, is still a Jewish hero to this day, if you can believe it, is that he, Cyrus, not only beat the Babylonians, he also allowed the Hebrews to return from exile and, crucially, rebuild their temple. That actually happened on such a short timeline that there were people who had witnessed the destruction of the first temple and could now, in 515 BCE, observe the completion of the second one. Critically observe, that is, because the new version of the temple wasn't just lacking many ritual objects of its predecessor, most notably the Ark of the Covenant. It was also significantly smaller and a lot less grand than Solomon's temple had been, presumably because construction didn't just happen on a much smaller budget, but also with Persian oversight. And the reason what we're looking at right now is both big and grand is this guy, King Herod the Great. There are a couple of reasons for that moniker, one of which is the fact that he sponsored the Olympic Games. Also, and more to the point, in about 20 BCE, Herod took the original Second Temple and updated it to this, basically version 2.2. On top of that, he made the Temple Mount a lot bigger and put a stabilizing wall enclosure around it, whose western part, literally the Western Wall, still stands today, also known as the Wailing Wall. Now, with only a fleeting interest in either religion or history, you know what's coming. Not only was there another prophecy about the destruction of the temple by one Jesus of Nazareth, there was also another foreign power encroaching on Hebrew territory, the Romans this time. And when the Jews revolted, the Second Temple, again somewhat predictably, given its significance, got destroyed in 70 CE. Now, as the attentive passengers on this flight will no doubt have noticed, there is a small but decisive difference between the prophecies predicting the destruction of the first and the Second Temple respectively, in that the latter prediction was made by Jesus, who became the founder of Christianity, whose relationship with Judaism to this day remains complicated, shall we say. On top of that, Jesus had referred to himself as the new temple, which to his followers meant that there was no need to build a brick-and-mortar structure in addition to that. The result being that even after Rome had become a Christian empire, neither its western nor its eastern or Byzantine parts showed any interest in building a new temple. Also, without that centerpiece, the whole Temple Mount moved out of the spotlight and, at least according to some sources, into disrepair for centuries, with descriptors reaching from rubble to landfill. The somewhat brutal logic from a Christian perspective was simply this. Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, so rebuilding it would prove Jesus wrong. Which is why the Roman Emperor Julian, who hated Christianity, tried to do exactly that in the 4th century, with a lot of money no less. And if it hadn't been for a devastating earthquake that ended the project, the Temple Mount might look very different today. Oh, and also shortly thereafter, Julian died, after invading Persia without a clear-cut plan. I'm not even kidding. So the question at this point is obviously this. Why does the Temple Mount look the way it does today and has been looking like that for a very long time by now? And why did it start looking like that while the Christian Roman Empire was still around? Well, as I alluded to earlier, Judaism and Christianity aren't the only Abrahamitic faiths assigning enormous significance to this location, from the city of Jerusalem in general, the Temple Mount in particular, and especially the foundation stone. When Islam was established by the Prophet Muhammad in Mecca at the beginning of the 7th century, the community of Muslims, the Ummah, was praying towards Jerusalem, just like every synagogue, by the way, the place from which the world was created and the place where Abraham almost sacrificed his son. Also, another connection, when Abraham built the Kaaba in Mecca, he gave it a perfectly cubic shape, just like the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Solomon. Oh, and the veils are there too. And when, according to Muslim faith, Muhammad ascended to heaven to receive divine instructions, he did it from the foundation stone on the Temple Mount, right there. This is still the same spot. And to the backdrop of all that, the following should actually not come as too big a surprise, although I realize it just might, because it sure came as a surprise to me. When the Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 638, the Temple Mount is desolate. That's because the Christians have left the Temple Mount desolate to emphasize that Christ's prophecy of the destruction of the temple had been fulfilled. That's not the surprising part, of course, but here it comes. So when the Muslims arrive, there's a big empty space there, and they take the opportunity to build for themselves a shrine, which is the rebuilding of Solomon's temple. And this is, of course, the Dome of the Rock. The building we're looking at right now, literally built on the rock. That rock, still in Jerusalem today, still opposite the Western Wall. Meaning the early Muslims saw themselves as simply rebuilding the Temple of Solomon. They rebuilt the temple as the Dome of the Rock. They understood the Dome of the Rock as the temple. In other words, we have the readiness of the early sources to speak of Arab building activity on the site as restoring the temple. Even retrospectively, interestingly, and even in a faith, mind you, that is so reticent towards iconography as Islam. So when we look at this Muslim depiction of the destruction of the Temple of Solomon by the Babylonians, what is getting destroyed here is the building the Muslims believed was that temple, the temple they had just rebuilt. And as you can tell by looking at the dome, that is the Dome of the Rock. That belief was held by Muslims in general, and specifically when it came to the person who actually built the Dome of the Rock. Here he is, Abd al-Malik, who was later proclaimed Caliph, and whose, Abd al-Malik's, target was to be the new Solomon. I mean, it makes sense. After all, in the Quran, Solomon is revered as a miracle-working prophet. Also, Abd al-Malik named his son, that's right, Solomon. Oh, and one of his grandsons was named David. And when this building, had been completed, it was only open to the public on 2 days of the week, Mondays and Thursdays, the classic Torah reading days during the week. Yeah, the Dome of the Rock was indeed built by Muslims to be the new Temple of Solomon. But of course, so far, we've only been looking at the Muslim perspective. Also, you might be wondering, if this is supposed to be the third installment of the Temple of Solomon, why doesn't it look like the Temple of Solomon? Well, you know what else didn't look like the Temple of Solomon? That's right, the Second Temple. And even when the latter got reworked under Herod, that still only meant glow-up, not mimesis. For instance, the Temple of Solomon, according to the Bible, had 2 bronze pillars, while the Second Temple didn't have any pillars. Also, like I said, there are no authoritative visual delineations of Solomon's temple, so overall, the latter will always remain aesthetically unique. Speaking of which, the Holy Ark of the Covenant is, of course, not inside the Dome of the Rock. But like I mentioned before, it wasn't in the Second Temple either. It's just gone. On top of that, I keep seeing references to the Dome of the Rock as a mosque. It's not a mosque. It's never been a mosque, starting with the fact that the so-called Qibla, the direction of prayer towards Mecca that all mosques have, simply isn't there. I mean, there is, of course, a mosque on the Temple Mount, a famous one to boot, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. There it is, to the south. It was built shortly after the Dome of the Rock. Yes, the Muslims built what they considered the Third Temple before they built a mosque. And it wasn't just about the Muslim perspective either, far from it. Amikam Elad, who is one of the most recognized authorities on this topic, says, "The Jewish background to the construction of the Dome of the Rock has been commonly accepted by scholars. The Jewish connection is evident in the early traditions on the rituals held at the foundation stone, which were most probably an echo of Jewish ceremonies held at the temple. And apparently and interestingly, it seems like that Jewish connection was actually a mutual thing. As Milka Levy-Rubin explains, in its, meaning the dome's, early years, the ceremonies in the monument bore many similarities to those of the Jewish temple, including the ablutions, the vestments, the incense, and so on. Apparently in the 9th century, a famous Frankish monk named Bernard the Wise referred to the Dome of the Rock as a, quote, Muslim synagogue. Just imagine that. Continue, quote. And Jews were, in fact, involved in them, meaning those ceremonies, which actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. the Muslims obviously showed a lot of respect to the Jewish faith, starting with the fact that, while the Christians had turned the Temple Mount into a landfill out of sheer spite, the Muslims treated it as a holy place. They even kept the Jewish fast of mourning for the destruction of the first temple. And conversely, Jews kept extinguishing candles at the dome to commemorate that same event into the 20th century, no less. Witness accounts from the 13th century testify that Muslims even joined Jews for the celebration of the second Passover, and so on. On top of that, the Christians had actually banned Jews from Jerusalem. So when the Muslims lifted that ban, apart from everything else, of course there was Jewish involvement when it came to the Dome of the Rock. And that involvement took on various forms, apart from the weekly schedule I just mentioned. Apparently Jews also helped maintain the place. Also, this involvement was there to stay. There are reports that in the 1160s, the famous Jewish philosopher and legal scholar Maimonides went to the Dome of the Rock to pray there. Keep in mind, this is still during the Crusader period, when, as I just mentioned, Jews were banned from Jerusalem, meaning he actually snuck into the city. Oh, and after his return to Egypt, Maimonides wrote his famous Jewish law code, the Minesh Torah. And as you can see here, the red text says, okay, according to ChatGPT, it says, laws of the temple. And won't you look at that temple? And just like mosques have qiblas to point the way to, today, Mecca, by the same token, many Jewish homes have a so-called mizrah on a wall, pointing in the direction of Jerusalem. And like in this case, protecting the house and its family, with, of course, the temple at the center of it all. Here we have a printer's mark from the 16th century, where the words explicitly refer to the temple. And here's the temple. And all these weren't isolated examples either. In Jewish art, the Dome of the Rock came to stand for the ancient Temple of Solomon. Right up until the late 1920s, the Dome of the Rock often stood for the temple in Jewish art. This is even true for the issue of the end of time in Judaism, in which the Third Temple plays a major role. Well, here's a woodcut from the 17th century with exactly that moment. Over on the left, we have the Messiah making his way to the central gate for his triumphant entry into Jerusalem. Heralding him is the prophet Elijah. And here is the temple, which would have to be the Third Temple. And it's not just the Jewish connection either, because there is, of course, an interested third party. So if you're wondering about this distinct, yet distinctly non-Muslim look and design, in both cases, the dome and the mosque, then the aesthetic reference point is actually not that far away, down in the old city of Jerusalem. Here it is, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built by the Christian Emperor Constantine and therefore not on the Temple Mount, but near Golgotha. However, just like many other churches, say the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre functioned as somewhat of a surrogate temple, in a way just like Jesus himself. And in lieu of the visuals of Solomon's temple, guess where the Muslims got their idea for a dome at the top? And not only are the shapes identical, they're also the same size. So yes, there's absolutely also a Christian connection. And just like before, that connection was, and in this case actually still is, mutual. Because you know who opens the doors to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre every single morning and who closes them every single night? 2 Muslim families. Amazing. And again, that mutuality extended to the Dome of the Rock. As the trusted Encyclopedia Britannica explains, Jews and Christians identified the Dome of the Rock with the Temple of Solomon. And just like in the Muslim and Jewish examples earlier, there are so many descriptions and depictions in a Christian context to that same effect that when Catherine Blair Moore writes about the pervasive association of the Dome of the Rock with the Temple of Solomon, she's not wrong. Here's a fresco, meaning a painting on wet wall. That wall standing in the Vatican, no less, from the 15th century, where Jesus hands Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Behind them is the temple. I'm sure you'll recognize it by now. And this is in spite of the fact that at this point in time, the Dome of the Rock would not be built for another 6 centuries. Talk about retconning. just like before in the Muslim example. The Dome of the Rock is not just understood to be the new temple, that assumption is being projected into the past. Also from the 15th century, we have a depiction showing Christ's crucifixion up here, with him, as I said, being understood as the new temple, and at the center, the old temple, aka the Dome of the Rock. And that, again, is in spite of the fact that at that point in time, the temple actually would have looked different. Also, as we're doom-scrolling here, this is a depiction from the 13th century showing Christ at a cathedral and Solomon at his temple. Notice the shape? The same goes for a century prior. Here we see Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and there's the Dome of the Rock, meaning the temple. Here we have a famous 16th century painting called The Marriage of the Virgin by Raphael. Yes, that Raphael of School of Athens fame, with, again, the temple in the background. Who wouldn't want to get married in front of that? So I think you get the picture, literally. It wasn't just the Jews and the Muslims. The understanding of the Dome of the Rock as the new Temple of Solomon, the third temple, is deeply rooted in Christianity as well. Hence, when medieval Christians came and said, "We visited the temple," they meant the Dome of the Rock. Here's probably the most famous example in that regard, from the world's first illustrated travel guide, if you can believe it, by some rich European guy who traveled to Jerusalem and brought along an artist to depict his voyage, basically his personal photographer. And here is the image from the Civitas Jerusalem. The spelling is a little dated, with the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock, which is, of course, the Temple of Solomon. No quotation marks, no asterisk. This is the Temple of Solomon. Thank you very much. And it wasn't just regular people either. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade in 1095, he scolded the Muslims for having defiled the temple in Jerusalem with their inscriptions. Notice something? I mean, never mind the fact that those were also the very people who had built it. But the crucial point here is, of course, that he still referred to this building as the temple. Also, while I still don't fully understand the Freemasons' metaphysical dispositions and their exact relationship to Christianity, here is a depiction from the 13th century showing Solomon at his temple with Hiram of Tyre holding a square, which would later be interpreted as a Masonic symbol. Of course, both of them are presumably debating that beautiful dome on the temple, literally Solomon's temple. And of course, as our last example here, we have an organization whose ties to Christianity were never in doubt. An organization that was solely dedicated to the temple, literally the Knights Templar, a powerful monastic military order. And here is their so-called Great Seal, including the temple on the back, which is, again, the Dome of the Rock. And kind of surreptitiously, as you can see over here, the cross is presented as belonging to the text segment. But of course, when you place the dome right under it, it looks like it has been repurposed as a Christian church. Which is exactly what happened. They placed murals on the inside walls of the Dome of the Rock related to biblical stories about the temple. Because, after all, that's where they were. Also, on this last point, I'm happy to report that we have corroboration coming from the one source I consider the deepest well of knowledge, insight, and wisdom, and that is, of course, Meta AI. So, on my question, how did the Templars use the Dome of the Rock after 1099, when the First Crusade captured Jerusalem? It says, after the 1099 capture of Jerusalem, the Crusaders repurposed the Dome of the Rock as a church, calling it the Templum Domini, Temple of the Lord. They believed it was the Temple of Solomon. Smiley face. Aw, the hallmark of serious research. I told you this was a high-end production. Now, after all of that, the obvious question here is this. What on earth happened here? Because, as you might have noticed, while the building is still there, I mean, we're looking at it right now, so while the building is still there, the prevalent perspective on it today is distinctly different from that of the people who were around when it was built. or centuries after that for that matter. Many centuries, in fact. Just one last example that really baffled me. In January of 1857, Herman Melville, yes, that Herman Melville, New York City start to finish, the guy who wrote Moby Dick, he went to the Temple Mount, and in his travel logs, his equating of the Dome of the Rock with the Temple of Solomon becomes so obvious that Monagataya correctly says, for him, as well as for his readers, both become interchangeable. 1857. And as we heard earlier, that actually lasted into the 20th century. So again, why did that change? Everyone's centuries-long willingness and ability to equate, to merge the Temple of Solomon and the Dome of the Rock, religiously, conceptually, artistically, and practically. Here is one way of answering that question that is both brilliant and sad. Undoubtedly, politics and mimesis go hand in hand throughout the history of the Dome of the Rock. I see. Remember the underpinnings we talked about earlier, the religious underpinnings of politics? Yeah, turns out there's also the opposite. Questions of power impacting religious beliefs, including the latter's conveyance. And as someone who is not a historian, but a political scientist, my years in political consulting alone have taught me this. You cannot build power on unity, consensus, and mutual understanding. That has always been and will always be a mere derivative to the actual foundation of power. Division, strife, and a distinct lack of understanding. The downright universal 13 centuries long perspective on the Dome of the Rock as the third version of the Temple of Solomon went away the very moment the Middle East started becoming the political powder keg it still is today. So Pamela Berger is certainly not wrong when she says that this change coincided with mounting conflict. It's just that that only insinuates correlation when in fact we're talking about a causal relationship here. The powers that be today have a vested interest in perpetuating this change, nobody else. And don't get me wrong, it's not like the powers that be, say, in the 7th century had no vested interests. It's not like they didn't utilize division, strife, and a lack of understanding for political purposes. After all, power and its mechanics have been around for much longer than that. Yet they somehow understood that their metaphysical dispositions superseded and, in a way, were supposed to supersede their secular interests, given the former's contents, especially when they overlap with those of others. And I mean, just in general, when you're looking for people in history who, at least comparatively speaking, understand that their different faiths share a common origin, and so much more, and that the overwhelming significance of that realm, that space, presents and almost imposes itself as a lever to bridge their secular differences. When you're looking for those people in history, and among the ones you find are Muslim invaders, Jewish insurgents, and the Templars, then when it comes to today's religious and political leadership, I pretty much rest my case. So yeah, what Pamela Berger just called this change has clearly taken place. That change might have only happened 5 weeks ago in the broader scheme of things. It might have only taken 5 minutes to happen, but there can be no doubt that what we're looking at is a before and after scenario. Before, for many centuries, we had, let's call it perspective A. A as in all aboard, with a three-party willingness to recognize and appreciate common ground and to go from there. And after, meaning today, we're dealing with perspective B. B as in ballistic missile. Again, a solid three-party approach. That is the situation we find ourselves in. And the question here is obviously, where does that leave us? And if you should only take one thing from this flight, please let it be this. Only from the highest position of your own strength should you interpret the past. And sure, that is a little more generic because the issue at hand is more generic, which is why we'll get into that down the road. But in all those cases, including this one, the first clue here is obviously that in a scenario where none of us have ever experienced that past as a present, in a scenario like that, there are no two elements here. There's no objective historical facts on the one hand, and then, on the other hand, there's the interpretation. That interpretation is that past, which is why George Orwell famously stated that whoever controls the present controls the past. And in the case of our two perspectives, A and B, it's not like perspective B would have an epistemological edge over perspective A. All that it has is a power edge. It's not about convincing, it's about imposing. After all, we know what the B stands for. And of course, looking at this again, given that perspective B is backed by the powers that be, this is exactly what they're doing as well, from the highest position of their own strength. And to tie it down to our issue at hand, where that leaves us is with the relationship between today's dominant perspective, B, and our perspective, whatever it is. Meaning, if we want what the powers that be want, namely that this building is not the third temple, that in fact it needs to be torn down for the third temple to be built, literally in its place, if we want that, then we already got what we want. Because that's exactly the situation we're facing today. The threat this building is facing today. However, if we do want this building that we're looking at right now, if we want that to be the third temple, then there is more than enough evidence to support that claim, starting with the people who built it, the people who prayed in it, and the people who named their organization for it. After all, we're not talking about a bodega in New York. We're talking about the Dome of the Rock, on the Temple Mount and the foundation stone, with all the history we just looked at. So, content-wise, perspective A has no reason to sell itself short. And the reason that decision between perspectives A and B is not only relevant today is, as Orwell actually went on to say, who controls the present controls the past. And who controls the past controls the future. So again, Nietzsche's plea to focus on our own strength when interpreting the past, that plea is far from being solely about the past. The powers that be that expediently mold the past into a certain shape, by the same token, mold the future, including the future of this building. Meaning the first step in reaching what Nietzsche calls the highest position of our own strength is recognizing that perspective B is not made of insight, but of might. Historicity is not the substance of perspective B. That's just a veneer. There is nothing epistemologically, historically, or factually deficient about perspective A, other than being detrimental to power, as we saw earlier. And by the same logic, the fact that perspective B is very conducive to power explains why it is still in the process of shaping our present, future, and past. In a way, it's like the old saying in linguistics, a national language is nothing but one dialect with an army. And just like by the same token, money is just a piece of paper with an army, reality, including historical reality, is just a perspective. One perspective with an army. One perspective plus power equals reality, present, future, or past. Because might doesn't make right, it makes real. Quite the topic to come back to, wouldn't you say? Which, for now, brings me to my most important point. Thank you so much for joining me on this flight. It means a lot to me.
Oh, no place like home.
You can say that again. I'll see you around.